My name's Steve McGowan. I'm Vice President of Cybersecurity at BlackBerry. I run the corporate security team there. And I'm here today to talk to you about the changing role of today's CISO. I think there's a lot of senior leaders in this audience already, so much of what I'm going to say is not going to be a huge revelation to you. I'm just going to share my experience and my perspective on what it means and where it's going. Right. So I think the main issues driving the evolution of the CISO role right now are rapidly evolving threat landscape. BlackBerry being a software security vendor, I'll speak a little bit about our perspective of how that affects us. It's going to be different for every company, but we all know that the bad guys are getting better fast, and that's a big part of the problem we're dealing with. There's an unrelenting demand for increased vigilance, compliance, protecting revenue, that sort of thing. We're expected to do far more, and often, budget can be a challenge in the security world, we all know. You really have to sell it. You have to make the business argument and explain why it threatens revenue and what the profit loss or what the risk loss ratio is so that you can get buy-in from business leaders so that they understand the risk that they're taking and what they mean. That's probably the biggest thing. And most importantly, last but not least, the threat of legal liability. I don't think that issue is news to anyone in this audience. CISOs are being thrown in prison. CISOs are being sued by angry shareholders. That scares a lot of us and puts us in a difficult situation where there's a fundamental, I wouldn't say conflict, but balance between our responsibility to protect revenue for any company and our responsibility to be open and honest and not conceal things. It's kind of counterintuitive. Most people don't want to stand up and wave their arms and say, hey, guess what, we have a problem. But not doing that nowadays is not acceptable. And for large, by and large, that's a good thing. I think it's really waking people up. It's opening the doors and leaving behind the days when everybody would cover things up and hide things and create dangerous situations for users in the cyber community. So there's been a 650%, speaking about it from a BlackBerry perspective, software vendor, a 650% increase since 2015 in software supply chain attacks. Threat actors have figured out that this is a good deal and a good way to spread their back doors and so on and so forth, especially nation-state actors. That creates a very challenging situation for CISOs. We're accustomed to buying software and trusting it, but can you now? That's the key thing, right? So I'll talk about something in a little bit about what's happening in the software world for those of you that don't work in that space, but I don't need to really talk too much about it, but SolarWinds gave backdoor access to Russian military operatives across 18,000 customers, including some three-letter agencies in the United States, like National Security Risks. Kodakov, another company that most people haven't heard of because it's not publicly traded. Didn't make quite the splash in the news, but it was equally as sophisticated as the SolarWinds attack, and they gained access to 19,000 customers, including some big names like HP, IBM, Procter & Gamble, GoDaddy, domain name registration. So it's scary stuff. If you're buying software now, you have to be extra sure that that software is safe, and you can't just blindly trust it anymore. So there are things being done, but everybody's got to be on their best game. Regulatory compliance. What I was talking about with the increased vigilance. Biden executive order, for those of you who aren't familiar, it was brought out to protect national security interests in the wake of the SolarWinds attack. And basically what they're demanding, what the government's demanding of anybody who wants to do business with a government agency, that they produce what's called an SBOM, a software bill of materials, which is not just a list of ingredients, but it's also their pedigree. You have to say where they came from. So there are known good repositories and not so good repositories. That all has to be published on a software vendor's website, which creates a very challenging situation. It's been, the increased vigilance part of the equation has been quite demanding. It's a complex mix. A lot of people are afraid that this is effectively a treasure map that's being posted on the internet, but if handled properly, it's assurance that when you buy a piece of software, that it's been properly vetted and that there aren't any nefarious things going on under the hood. Open source libraries, we all know threat actors love that stuff. It's an easy way to distribute their malicious code. But the days are gone when that can be ignored and not worried about. The SolarWinds stock, the financial vigilance, it's always a responsibility of a CISO to protect revenue for any company. The financial hit against SolarWinds was substantial. They lost 40% market cap within a week of the breach announcement. They lost 55%, over 55% since. I checked, I think the lowest the stock, it was at $25 pre-breach. The lowest the stock has gone is like $7.50. So that's a big dive. Right? I think they're back up, they're sitting somewhere in the mid-10s right now, but like 55, 60% market cap loss. And the shareholders showed up on the front lawn with pitchforks and came looking for the CISO, right? So that's a wake-up call for us all. Tim Brown, I don't think that story is unknown to anyone in this audience, was sued as an individual because the key problem being, the key message of this is that CISOs are traditionally not an officer of the company, so they're not normally indemnified under D&O insurance. That leaves you exposed. And the Tim Brown situation, what it taught us all is to be careful of overly optimistic claims or any claims at all that can be turned around and used to say, hey, you said, by angry shareholders. That's the environment that we're working in now. And so it's like public speaking like this. There's a need to be very, very vigilant and very careful about making exuberant claims, because if something bad does happen, that will be used. Things like in the SolarWinds breach, I think most of us are pretty familiar with it, but they found one server with the password SolarWinds123. And that didn't actually factor into the breach, but it looked really bad in court, right? So it's a lot of sentiment behind this sort of thing. The people suing the class action lawsuit, they used that, even though it was proven not to have been a factor in a breach. It gave the impression of a culture of carelessness, right? So, and they said that an intern had done it. Well, we all have interns working for us. That excuse is not going to fly in court. Just never underestimate what little piece of information can be used. Joseph Sullivan, I think most of us are familiar with that more recently. He tried to mislead Federal Trade Commission investigators. Bad idea. These people don't like to be lied to. And so the key thing is the balance between protecting revenue and being open and honest and genuine in your dealings with these people, understanding that trying to hide it just makes it worse. That's a difficult situation for a security leader to be in, but it is our situation. We have to have a balance of honor and integrity and balance and protecting revenue, protecting our company, but also protecting, like if we're distributing software to tens of thousands of companies and backdoors get into it, that's a serious problem. It's not just a cyber problem, it's a national security risk, right? So it's big stuff. A lot of pressure on CISOs these days over that. So what options do security leaders have? It's increasing vigilance. It takes more money. Business leaders don't love that. Security is often seen as a cost center. I've always been very successful in risk management. We have an operational model. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. How much is an incident likely to cost? What's the probability of it happening over a 5-year period? If it's got a 20% chance of happening over a 5-year period and it will cost $5 to $10 million if it does, then that becomes an easy argument to say, let's spend $100,000, $200,000 to mitigate that risk. That sounds like a good business deal to a CEO. And that's the way it has to be sold. It's risk to revenue. What is the cost of not doing something? That's what CEOs respond to. So that's the way I frame all my arguments. But let's face it, I was at a conference like this many years ago, and I can't remember, one gentleman made a statement. He said, security leaders are always struggling with budget, and he said, you get the budget you deserve, which means it's how well you package it, how well you sell it. If you just go in there and say the sky is falling, and I need a bunch of money, that's not gonna get the job done. You have to put it in dollars and cents. You have to quantify how much it's going to cost if you don't do something, and then back that up with data. And that's the argument that'll win. Without that, you have the option to maintain the status quo. I mean, it depends on the corporate culture. It depends on your business model. It depends on what your risk profile is. Some leaders will just accept the risk and maintain status quo. I don't think, we in certain businesses, we can't afford to do that. We have to up the game. Too much at risk. You also have the option to transfer the risk, to outsource. And that's kind of my next topic up here is, it really depends. Outsourcing pros and cons. It really depends on what your business model and what your risk profile is. And it depends on what you're expecting to get out of it and what you need out of it. For a lot of leaders, they see outsourcing as a cost-saving, cost control measure. You got predictable costs. You got a monthly burn rate. You know what it's going to cost. And that's easy to budget on. And that's what a lot of leaders look for. We all know we have difficulty attracting and maintaining talent. There's a lot of competition for not a lot of people. And they get offered crazy salaries to go somewhere else. I've had this happen to myself. I'm sure you all have too. So outsourcing gives you access to somebody else's talent pool, and you don't have that risk. You don't have that problem to deal with. You're getting a slice of each expert. That's kind of the business model. That's a good thing. Scalability, the ability to blow up quickly as your what we call burst computing. As your profile expands and contracts, you can adapt to that quickly. And that, if you all of a sudden get a new line of business and you need to onboard 3,000 new log sources by tomorrow, you can do that in an outsource model. It's not your problem, the difficulty behind the scenes. Reduce risk, transfer risk. It's the one throat to choke thing. If you've got a separate company that you've hired, you can hold them accountable. However, I would advise not to grow too confident in that, because I talk about the Okta breach, for instance. It was actually a company in Romania called CISOs that was breached. But nobody's calling it the CISOs breach, right? Everybody's calling it the Okta breach. Target, very famous breach. They were breached through an HVAC vendor, but nobody's calling that HVAC vendor out. It's the Target breach. So if you think that hiring a third-party partner, an MSSP or what have you, that you can say, well, it's all their fault, you might be able to say that in court, but the court of public opinion won't buy it. Basically, it'll be yours. So I understand that you can transfer risk to a degree, but you still own the risk publicly. So don't ever think that you can get away from that. Again, it depends on your business model. Are you publicly traded? Are you a private company? Big difference, right? We're publicly traded, so that's the perspective I'm coming from. And the cons, the downside, is the risk of misunderstanding and communication problems if expectations aren't clear. And I've seen many scenarios. We can talk about the other things, loss of control, where everything's at arm's length and you don't have the in-depth knowledge. You don't have the ability to call up Joe and he's going to give you the true story in 5 minutes kind of thing. You lose that a little bit. You don't have the insight that you would if they were your own team. Flexibility to change on a dime. Business is agile. Sometimes we need to be. It's a lot more difficult to be agile with an outsourced vendor, because they'll say, we have a contract, and it says we're going to do X, Y, Z, and now you want us to do ABC. That's more money, right? Confidentiality. You're exposing your inner workings to a partner. In most business models, and many business models, that doesn't matter. In some, it very much does. And you have to understand that if, like in the case of CISOs in Romania, if they don't guard their gates well, they could let your data out the door. So you still own that risk. Costs are transactional. This is a big one I've seen with outsourced providers. Everything is done by a number of tickets, and I've seen situations where just a simple policy change, a seemingly innocent policy change that everybody thinks would be no big deal, and suddenly your cost of help desk password change tickets triples, and your boss gets a huge bill and calls you up and says, what's going on? Like that kind of thing is a big risk, because they are very myopic. You contracted us to do X, Y, Z, and that's what we're going to do, and it's per call. So you have to be really mindful of that. You can get yourself into cost overruns very quickly. One of the key things I've seen happen in the past is and this comes down to setting expectations and understanding your scenarios and your use cases very well before you get into this. HR investigations is a key one, where you've got an employee that has done something nefarious and you need to prove it. And now you need a forensic investigation. That's a whole different animal that will not be included in a base contract. And if you say, look, I need you to search through I actually had this situation at a previous company where we needed them to search through email and find an evidence trail, produce artifacts. And they said, please produce $50,000 and we'll be happy to do that for you. And the manager said, what is this? Because they'd never anticipated that. They'd never anticipated that scenario. HR investigations can be quite big in this space. I have a forensics team reporting to me that does this, and I know what's involved. And if I had to pay an outsourced vendor, like to get that included in a contract, because forensics, the resources are special. They're not your standard run-of-the-mill people watching monitors. You're not just going to get that thrown in for free, right? Then if you want these highly trained, highly specialized people to dig through your evidence and sit in a court and talk about that evidence, that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars very easily, very quickly. And this is not an infrequent occurrence. You think it's sort of out of band? I've seen it happen a lot. So these are the kind of things to anticipate when you're outsourcing. Like use cases you don't think of at the time, when they pop up, suddenly it's out of band spend and it can be big. So you need to really prepare yourself for that. Understand that these people, they have blinders on. When you sign a contract with them, they're going to do what's in the contract. And they're going to do exactly that and nothing more. And if you want more, if the situation comes up where you want or need more, you're going to have to pay. So that's kind of my main points on the outsourcing thing. Outsourcing can be really valuable for the right company. Again, it depends on your business model and your risk profile. And a lot of companies use outsourcing third parties in a wide variety of different ways for obvious reasons. It's often cheaper, but you get into other countries with, you have to be very careful who you sign contracts with. And in certain countries, the corruption index in some of these countries is not fantastic. So the controls have to be in place. If you're going to sign a contract with a third-party vendor in another country, especially in Eastern Europe or somewhere like that, you need to make sure that you've got the controls in place. It's trust but verify. Because it only takes, what we would consider, a bribe big enough to buy you lunch here is enough to turn an insider into a threat in some of these places, right? So UEBAs, pattern watching, everything has to be 100% on point. And that can be quite expensive. Sometimes just to set up the infrastructure for a small company to enable that, to do that safely, can be more expensive than the actual savings that you'll get from outsourcing. So the biggest mistake I've seen is underestimating your requirements and not clarifying them at the outset and then getting bitten later by that. So that's the main content that I have to share today. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir. It is, yes. Well, I mean, as you say, that's a wide term. Outsourcing can mean a lot of things. I'm just talking about the main pain points that I've seen in outsourcing. I mean, a lot of people will outsource, even Microsoft, they outsource software code reviews, testing, that sort of thing. Incident response, definitely. I mean, that's a very common one, especially for SMBs, right? It's difficult for a smaller company to even build up the expertise, let alone retain the skills and so on and so forth. So that's a no-brainer. Outsourcing can mean a lot of things. You're talking about the stack. I mean, for me, I look at outsourcing software development and mostly code testing, that sort of thing. And then SOC operations, obviously. Forensics is a big one because if you're going to outsource forensics, it's you never know when you're going to need it, and you never know how much you're going to need. It's a very unpredictable thing to outsource, right? But just be aware that if you don't factor it in. If you think it's not going to happen to you, when it does happen, it will be expensive. So, does that answer your question adequately? Yes, sir. Outsourcing the what, sorry? Oh, the doing. I personally wouldn't outsource leadership. I think it's important to maintain that in-house. I'm not sure. I haven't come across a scenario where that would make sense to me. I'm not sure what scenario you might be using or referring to if you have an example or something. I think the leadership has to stay in-house because the company's interests have to be looked at. The problem is when you outsource, you have to understand you're paying somebody to look after their interests first and your interests second. I don't. Okay, the virtual CISO is a different deal. Yeah, I mean, BlackBerry has virtual CISOs. Many provider companies like us do. That's a different scenario. I'm sorry, I hadn't thought of that. That makes a lot of sense because you're really you're hiring the knowledge base, the strategy piece you are. And for a lot of SMBs, that makes a lot of sense because there aren't a lot of CISOs out there. There aren't a lot of senior leaders that are in this space that can provide the direction. And again, it makes sense. If you're a small company and you only need a slice of a CISO, then we don't do that personally. I think it makes sense for a lot of smaller companies, though. I don't think it would make a lot of sense for bigger companies. I mean, the doer stuff that's pretty straightforward. It's pretty much a predictable model. It's very black and white. As long as you consider all your use cases and your scenarios, it gets very, very gray if you miss any. Yes, sir. Yeah, exactly. That's always the challenge. Yeah. I absolutely agree, and I would take that one step farther. I say as a virtual CISO, having been a consultant myself for 16 years before I got into the senior leadership space, everything in writing. If it's not written down, it didn't happen, and not just in writing, but clarity. And it goes back to the same thing I said about the outsourcing, the MSSP stuff. Meeting minutes with clear, concise points. Assume nothing. Assume, it's very easy to get tripped up in a provider client scenario where you assume that they think a certain thing or they understand a certain thing and they didn't. That's where you're going to get tripped up, right? So you need to be rock solid clear, like I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this and this means that and that means that, period. And please confirm. And quite often you'll find that they won't confirm. Vendor, a lot of clients are reluctant to send back and say okay, but the fact that it's actually in an email, you've got an artifact. Artifacts are everything in an investigation. I'll tell you right now. And what's written down, if it's not the right stuff, can go either way on you. Right? This is the most important thing to remember, that when you send an email, it's not just an email; it's potentially an artifact. So, someday down the road when something does go wrong, you find yourself in a SolarWinds or whatever kind of situation, those artifacts become very important very quickly. Just always be cognizant of that. When you're writing an email, you're creating an artifact. And that artifact is important if the risk comes to pass, if the risk is realized. Okay. Anyone else?
Interesting talk, and thank you. In terms of the cons, do you look at exiting a relationship with an outsourcer?
It has to be. There have to be conditions that, if not met, this constitutes an exit. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do. It's sort of like ripping something out by the roots. It's not going to be clean, right? You're never going to, when you develop a relationship with a third party, especially if they're testing code, or we had to do it, I mean, in Eastern Europe with, when the war broke out, we exited a relationship very quickly. And, it's painful. It causes business impact. So there's got to be a real clear understanding that the risks exceed the reward. That's got to be quantified in advance, definitely. I think it's important. That's one of the scenarios you need to look at. Like, if you're having ongoing problems with your provider and you've not considered, what would end the relationship up front, then ending the relationship is a dirty business. There's no question.
Retrieving data and artifacts from them?
Well, I follow a policy. I try to avoid giving them as much data as possible. I always I push for architecture where the data stays resident with us and they come to us and they access it. I mean, if you're transferring data across the wire to some country halfway around the world and not controlling that data, that's a ticking time bomb as far as I'm concerned. Like, they should come to you. You should control the data. You should be able to cut the cord on a moment's notice, and your data is where you need it to be. That's the way that's 100%. Like, if you're looking, that's more expensive. There's no question. You spend money on that. However, you look at the Ukraine war, prime example. A lot of companies, big companies, Microsoft, they had to cut cords. And if the data is, somewhere else, you don't know what they're doing with it. You can't control what they're doing. They could tell you. I mean, with the Sykes breach in the Okta scenario, they said, "Oh, don't worry, everything's fine. It's good," right? Wasn't good at all. So, it goes back to when you're doing your SRAs, the supplier risk assessments, and the questionnaire thing. They can tell you whatever they want. If you don't verify it, it's meaningless. And that was one of the things that Okta said. One of the lessons learned was too much reliance on questionnaires. Questionnaires, I mean, I always say, take their questionnaire answers and put it in a contract and watch them sign that. They'll be much more reluctant to sign a lie. But, I mean, these vendors, they don't tell the truth. So you have to anticipate that, right? So if the data is outside your sphere of control, you have a problem from day one. Some kind of platform where they connect virtually in, be it cloud infrastructure or what have you, but a virtual infrastructure where they connect to your environment that you control. And you can cut the cord. They never pull the data down into their space. That, to me, is a bare minimum. This gentleman here had a question, sorry.
I'd like to hear your thoughts, especially for SMBs, around using cyber insurance as a risk transfer option.
Well, I mean, you might, there's a lot of talk about this. Cyber insurance, I think I'm in the camp that, in the life insurance and the auto insurance world, I have certificates in data science, so I'm familiar with the whole statistics thing and whatnot. In the auto and life insurance world, they've got decades of data that the actuarials can crunch on and measure their risk very accurately. They don't have this decades of data in the cyberspace, and so they're guessing on a moving target that's moving very quickly. And they're starting to figure out that their risk is far higher than they had quantified. So the big thing to understand is, yes, I mean, for some hard costs, you might be able to rely on insurance for a while longer. I'm not sure that you'll see cyber insurance in 5 years. I'm not going to call that one way or the other, but I think the insurance companies are starting to figure out that the risk is high and growing higher by the day. So it's not really a good bet from a risk perspective. As far as what insurance companies will pay, the hard costs, I don't know if you've ever been through a breach. Okay, there. A breach is an ugly experience. A lot of people pointing fingers, and I describe it like the Harry and Meghan scenario, where they came out with their story and everybody reacted and everybody had an opinion, even though they've never met these people. but the opinions online were huge, and the vocalism of those opinions was huge as well. A breach is very much the same way. It's organized chaos, hopefully organized if you got your act together, but for the first while, it's really chaotic, and everybody's scrambling to cover their backsides and whatnot. The real cost of a breach, insurance will cover the quantitative costs, or at least some of them. The qualitative costs, the softer stuff, that can go on and on and on in 50 different directions and hurt you in ways you'd never even anticipated. So I would say cyber insurance is an important part of the package of risk management, of risk transfer, but don't put all your eggs in that basket and don't put too much faith in it, because you're going to be running around in 50 different directions putting out fires, and insurance will only put out some of those, if that makes sense. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, I'm having a bit of a tough time hearing you.
Okay, so vendor due diligence, can you contrast how hard it is to get a vendor to give you objective results with regards to their security versus internal due diligence? You know, I guess it's a kind of a con to be able to have to extract kind of results out of a third party.
Are you saying like questionnaire answers and things like that, you mean, or?
Sorry?
Are you? Yeah, I would caution against trusting questionnaires too much, because we all know people, they fudge the answers. That's the bottom line. It's like, what I was going to say is there are third-party tools that will allow you to trust but verify. You know, risk awareness tools and so on and so forth. I'm not going to tout one or the other. There are many options. Just be aware with those tools that false positives are a big problem. I've had this problem with one of those vendors. I've had to call them up and say, hey, you know, you're wrong and you're reporting on the internet. Stop it. Like, you know, I've had to go to guns on them. So understand that, you know, if you're going to go to a third-party tool to verify your risk profile against a vendor or something, that's also a trust but verify. Take it with a grain of salt. Don't blindly follow, because a lot of the time some of these companies are just automating the process, blindly automating it, and they have no ownership or accountability for the data that they post. And when you call them up and say it's wrong, they kind of say, sorry, you know, yet the damage is done. We've got customers calling us saying what's going on. So understand that field isn't perfect. I think they are. I was going to say it really varies from one vendor to another. Yes, they definitely are getting better, but understand that, you know, ultimately, I don't think they're anywhere near the space where they could have 100% rock solid, reliable intel on what's going on inside a company. You know, just know that going in. I'm not saying don't trust them. I'm saying have a healthy skepticism, and just don't blindly follow the data. That's what I'll say. Yes, sir. Yes, yes.
Industry around it, right? Okay. So within that space, and I think I'm with you, I'm not a huge fan of it yet. My concern is it's misleading to people that want something to gravitate to, but it's an external posture score. It doesn't actually.
And that's exactly what I was getting at. You know, I don't want to get into too much proprietary information, but like they'll look at, for instance, if something is pinging to the outside world, which we all know is indicator and classic indicator. You know, maybe that address is no longer registered to you, but it was at some point, which is what happened to us, and our score plummeted. And I called them up and said, "It's not even our IP address." And then they're like, okay, you can fix it. And it's like, you know, I'd have to hire a team of 5 FTEs to go through all your data, you know, like, so, you know, they have no accountability. Like, and I shouldn't say they, some. They're all different, right? Some are good, some are bad. Some are automating it, some are really diligent and have very good quality products. You just need to do your homework and understand what you're buying, right? And yeah, it's the healthy skepticism to understand that false positives are always going to be reality. It is an outward view of your company. I mean, it's better than a questionnaire, I'll tell you that. The questionnaires are not reliable at all. When I met with the CISO of Okta after their breach, the first thing he said was, we were overly reliant on questionnaires. We trusted these questionnaires and they were nonsense. Big shock. No, you can't. I mean, this is just, like, there's obviously a huge need. There are a lot of vendors stepping in to fill that need, and just understand that the quality from one vendor to another can vary widely. That's the big thing. And even for the best of them, they're never going to be 100% perfect. But it's better than a questionnaire. That's the reality, right? Yes, sir. Yeah, it goes back to what I said before about the need for increased vigilance. Like the demands on us, the demand for vigilance is exploding exponentially. Yeah, so I can't go and say, okay, I need you to double my budget year over year, every year. That's, that's got to have a pretty good risk argument for that. So you have to get more efficient. I really work internally to avoid multiple screen distractions, like split attention for my people. The staff that I have, I really try to keep their attention focused on as few screens as possible, so that they're not overlooking things. You get 10 tools, 10 screens, you miss stuff. I'm getting the hook. The time to go. So I think unless there are any other screaming questions, I think I'm going to have to call it a wraps. Thank you very much for your attention, everybody.